Risdiplam is a drug used for to treat spinal muscular atrophy that costs $88,000 per patient per year. What does it explain this price?
Well, in some countries the price is even higher, but overall it's priced in such a way that almost no family of ordinary means can afford to buy the drug. And it's really unfortunate. The drug was developed through funding from a charity, the Spinal Muscular Atrophy Foundation, and then licensed eventually to Roche on an exclusive basis. So Roche really obtained the monopoly rights to the drug through contracts. And the cost of the development was it wasn't nothing, but it wasn't really a huge amount of money. And the prices are much higher than are necessary for Roche to recover its own investment in the product.
Ecology International actually prepared a study, right, that estimated the actual costs of the production of Risdiplam. Could you maybe walk us through in more detail what were the findings of the study?
Certainly. In terms of the clinical trials that are done on the drug, which is normally considered the most important part of the development process, the trials that were undertaken and were completed before the product was approved by the FDA involved less than 400 patients, and we were trying to find out from Roche how much each of the trials cost. We contacted Roche and we showed them some numbers that were a couple of times different estimates we had, but they refused to provide any feedback on the numbers that we showed them or provide any data themselves. What we ended up relying on were a study that was published in the British Medical Journal that estimated the sort of a range of clinical trial costs for drugs of a similar category. And I compared that to some confidential information I had from some people that were involved in some of the trials on the drug where they actually were paid by Roche to conduct the trial. So we were confident the numbers they seemed reasonable to us. Now, we estimate that the cost of the clinical trials through the approval of the drug by the FDA was under $20 million for the clinical trials. And that's before you applied the benefits of a tax credit that the United States gives to orphan products. We also noted that on the first day the product was approved by the FDA awarded a voucher to Roche for developing a treatment for a rare pediatric disease, and the value of the voucher was about $100 million. So they actually, before they sold the drug to a single patient, they made about 5 times more back on the value of the voucher than they paid on the trials to get the FDA approval of the drug.
In the study, you also cite that maybe the production, the estimate production could cost $50 per gram, correct?
If you can produce the API for about $50,000 per kilo, that translates into about $50 a gram. And for like the most a patient would take that drug in a given year would be less than 2 grams per year. So the cost of the active pharmaceutical drug, the active pharmaceutical ingredients for the drug would be not very expensive, actually. I mean, like a tiny fraction of what the selling price is. I mean, the cost of making the drug is more than the API cost, but the API cost normally, if you use a rule of thumb that the manufacturing cost would be double the API cost. That may not be the exact number, but that's a good starting point. And so it's really a drug that can be made for probably a few $100s a year per patient. And so the markup is enormous on the product. And the result of the high prices is that children that would benefit don't get it. About for SMA, more than half the children have a type of SMA that they will die before they're 2 years old if they're not treated. And some of the new trials show that if you treat the children right at birth with this drug, they might have a normal, symptom-free life. They may be able to do cartwheels, sports. I mean, just be like other kids. So time is of the essence. So how fast you get the drug to them once you can identify who the patients are is really, really important. This is a case where you have a really important medical innovation for a terrible disease that causes a lot of infant deaths. And it was developed on grants initially from a charity, and the majority of the children in the world do not have access to this treatment. But this has become a super profitable product, and there's a growth cycle. And one of the reasons why the revenues are growing for the product is that it's not a one-off treatment. So if you save the life of a child this year, that child is going to have the drug next year, the year after that, year after that. So over time, the number of patients that will be using the drug will grow. And so it's been a really profitable drug, and it's going to make a lot more money. People look at this as a business where you can make a lot of money, and it's also an area where you could treat a lot of patients. I mean, it could be, and sometimes those things are in conflict with each other. And we've been very critical of the charities that fund work on spinal muscular atrophy for not taking stronger measures to ensure the affordability and access to the product.
So this is not an isolated case. This is maybe the product model of rare disease drug development. Can we say that?
We see this over and over again, particularly for rare diseases. You saw it in the cystic fibrosis drugs. And I think the price of the SMA drugs probably was modeled after the high prices for the cystic fibrosis drugs. You see it for all sorts of other rare diseases. You see for the new cell and gene therapies as well. So one thing that we found in the gene and cell therapies is kind of an unusually large presence by charities and governments in funding the early research and sometimes the clinical trials on products. And despite that, the prices are really detached from any measure of anything that's related to cost to the company. And the only barrier they have is just how far they can push the insurance companies. No individual patient that I know of, I'm sure there are some, but no patient I know that could afford to pay. Like in the United States, the cost is over $1,000 a day, and I know of no family that could afford to pay that on their own. So it's really a conversation between Roche and insurance companies and governments, and they're really, really aggressive, Roche is.
Thank you. Any final comments?
Yeah, I think that people talk about fairness and equity and access to medicine for all is a term that comes up a lot in these World Health Organization resolutions, meetings, and trade agreements. And in my opinion, until you radically change the way that you incentivize R&D for drugs, you never will have equal access. And I think what's necessary is to reform the incentive system so it's not the grant of a temporary monopoly and high prices, but you have financial rewards to drug developers, which are delinked from the price of the drug. We just don't think that the answer to incentivizing drug development is to tell families they have to pay $88,000 or whatever it is in India to access a drug. That's just a crazy situation.
Thank you so much.